of building positive behavioral interventions and supports using Tier 2 practices. So today we are talking about part 2, which means that if you did not watch part 1, please pause here, go back to the website and find part 1 so that way you can have context for what we're jumping into today. Before we get started, if you'd like to go ahead and download or open up the Google Drive with all the materials you will need to engage with the learning today, there are resources, worksheets, and handouts that you can use to help implement these Tier 2 practices at your campus. So yes, in part 1, we focus on understanding MTSS and PBIS and how Tier 2 fits into those structures. We also looked at how to action plan around the implementation of check-in and check-out, focusing on that Tier 2 team, focusing on the screening and decision rules, and focusing on the implementation process. Today, we're going to review how we can really match the interventions with the needs of our students, and then we'll talk about planning for professional development and family support, and planning for our data monitoring. So again, here are our learning expectations as a model to share with you. So our expectations are to be responsible, be respectful, and be safe. And so what that would look like is taking care of yourself, listening to understand and assuming best intentions, and creating a safe space for dialogue and vulnerability. So as you implement these with your team, this could be a model for you to use as you build the structures on your own campus. All right, so let's get into matching interventions to student need. So when we think about matching student interventions to need, we need to really consider our contextual fit and think about our own kids' needs. And so in order to do that, we're going to talk today about check-in, check-out and how it can meet the basic needs for your students who need those layered on Tier 2 interventions. And then we'll think about your contextual fit. So what Tier 1 interventions do we have and how can we layer on there? So when we are thinking about student needs, we have to consider how different interventions may help us reach those different goals. So on the left side of this chart on your screen, you'll see some different functions or roots of behavior, and then also the systems that help support student needs. So we have access to adult attention, peer attention, access to choice, options for avoiding unwanted activities, options for unwanted social peer attention, and then we look at the systems. So structural prompts, 5 pieces of positive feedback, that school to home connection, and opportunities for adaptation in the self-management system. So when we look at these interventions on the top, we see that check-in, check-out should meet all 9 of these items. And then social skill clubs, reading buddies, homework club, and lunch buddies can support some of these different functions and some of these systems. So depending on what our students need and what our staff is capable of implementing, all of these interventions at the top might be appropriate depending on our needs and depending on our capacity. We've mostly focused on check-in, check-out as a system because of its ability to remain flexible while also meeting a lot of different functions of behavior and a lot of different needs, while also building the capacity of staff to layer on interventions at that Tier 2 level. So when we're thinking about deciding on an intervention to choose, we want to think about our interventions trauma-informed. And so when we think about the definitions of trauma-informed and resiliency, we define them as practices that support students along 4 characteristics: to strengthen relationships and attachment, to teach social emotional skills, to create safe and consistent and predictable environments, and to support regulation. And so when we're looking at check-in, check-out, and when it's implemented with Fidelity, it helps support those relationships and attachment. It gives a higher dose of that skilled teaching because we're actually modeling the behavior we want to see, giving direct feedback to our students daily, hourly. And then it also creates a system that is safe, consistent, and predictable because we know when the check-ins are going to happen. We have a system every day with the same safe adult that will build a relationship with that student. So teams can also consider your data when thinking about whether or not you need to practice regulation. is our regulation support all in tier 2 or are all in tier 1, depending on what your students need in terms of learning how to emotionally regulate. And just remember that when we're looking at our trauma-informed practices, we want to make sure that these are all also occurring in tier 1 across all classrooms, and thinking about what additional skills might need to be added to tier 1 based on the contextual or the context of our current reality. So the next section is really going to talk about tier 1 supports. And in order for tier 2 to be effective, we also know that we have to have tier 1 there, and students have to have access to these tier 1 interventions to make sure that our layering on is going to be successful and sustainable. And you can actually find a tier 1 virtual classroom training on the OSSE website where you found this recording. And we use these same exact principles as we apply them in tier 1. And so you can go there and watch that video to learn a little bit more. But we want to make sure that these same principles, defining expectations, pre-correcting for behaviors and skills, positively reinforcing those behaviors and skills, and correcting as part of a way of teaching, are not only part of our tier 1 systems, but also part of our tier 2 interventions. And so we want to make sure that in our check-in, check-out program, the school-wide expectations are reflected, the positive reinforcements are reflected, and connecting what we do for all students and what we do just for some very clearly for staff and for kids. And so when we think about our check-in, check-out system, we want to make sure that we're using the same school-wide expectations that we see across the whole school. We also want to think about how we can standardize the types of behaviors or rules that we want for our students who are enrolled in check-in, check-out, and standardize those across our systems to make sure that they are defined. And so teachers don't have to figure out for themselves whether or not a student is following those expectations or not. It is clearly defined and clearly taught for both the staff and the kids. And we also want to remember that the card or the daily progress report is not the actual point of intervention. The point of the intervention is to provide a systematic way for adults to provide positive adult attention to the students and provide the feedback so that way they can be better and we can be better for them. We can also use behavior-specific praise as we acknowledge students for succeeding in their daily progress report. This on its own has been shown to increase positive behavior and increase perceptions of positive relationships among students and adults. So when we use behavior-specific praise, this of course is a tier 1 practice used for all students, but it can be used at a higher dosage for students who are receiving those tier 2 supports. So when we use behavior-specific praise, we name the specific student, we acknowledge that behavior that they are doing correctly, and we tie it back to our school-wide expectations. It should take a minute or less, and it has been shown to be an evidence-based practice to increase the positive culture of a classroom. And so using this at the tier 2 level with a higher dosage in congruency with our check-in, check-out program will help make it more effective. We also want to make sure staff are aware about specific error correction and use that when needed. And so it follows the same steps of behavior-specific praise. We want to be specific about the behavior and share the replacement behavior that is expected. So that way it's a teaching opportunity instead of a punishment opportunity. We also want to always connect it back to our school-wide expectations that the students are familiar with and have been taught and have internalized. Again, this should take less than 1 minute. For the teacher to give feedback. It should be a calm and instructional approach. And so this, of course, again, is a tier 1 practice, but when we layer it on at tier 2, we want to make sure that we are pairing it with the specific expectations from their check-in, check-out program. And when we're thinking about having our tier 1 reinforcement system be a part of our check-in check-out program, we want to make sure that we include some kind of small daily reinforcement for our students. You don't have to, but you can. Again, the intervention is not the thing. It's not the sticker. It's not the toy. It's not the treasure chest. The intervention is the adult's attention. We also want to have opportunities for all students to earn larger reinforcements. So thinking about gaining longer term points or stickers on a chart. And then we also want to think about how we can do things that are free and accessible to all. So allowing free time, having lunch with a preferred adult, or providing coupons to school stores or things that are already accessible in the school building. When we think about our acknowledgement systems, we want to think about what the students' daily goal points will be, what reinforcers they'll receive, and what they will receive for meeting their daily goal, and how will you ensure students will not become bored or satiated on their reinforcers, right? So we've all heard if your school uses maybe a school store or something like that, that students are bored with it, they're not interested in it, right? And so we want from the offset to really think about how we're considering these questions when building our reinforcement system for that engagement in the check-in, check-out system. So when we're thinking about building these, we want to make sure that we include student voice. And so allowing students to really decide, what should my reinforcer be? If I get all my points on my check-in, check-out system, if I show up and do what I need to do every day at this tier 2 support level, what are things that would reinforce my behavior to make sure that I keep doing what I need to do to be successful until we can fade this intervention? And so I definitely use something like this with my students, and I also at the tier 1 level, so asking them what they would be interested in for an entire class, but then the students that I manage their check-in, check-out program for, we also had an activity reinforcer to make sure that whatever, just because I think a pizza party is really fun and I wanted to eat pizza on Fridays, that doesn't mean that's what my students are most interested in. So using something like this will really help you get feedback and build a system that will actually be effective for your students. We also can see that when we build out our reinforcement or acknowledgement systems, we want to make sure that we're tying it to the function or root of the behavior. And so if you look at this check-in, check-out trading post on your screen, you can see that there are points here on the left side, and then it has a clear function of behavior at the top to show what are some options that might best fit the needs of that student. So if a student's function of behavior is that they want attention, maybe it makes sense to have them buy the ability to be a school helper, or maybe have a computer activity with a friend, or go out to lunch with a chosen adult. If we know that they are really item motivated, they want certain things, students can choose their homework. They can have more time for different activities that they love, or they can have a student selected snack. If we know that they are really into escaping attention, or then we can have alone time, independent work time, or leaving class early to go to the library for a silent reading activity. If we know that the student wants to avoid something, so usually work, we can have they can buy short break cards, they can choose an alternative assignment, or they can again leave class to go to another location, maybe with a chosen adult. And so when we think of our check-in, check-out system, we know that pairing it with acknowledgements is a super effective way to make sure that students have the buy-in and it is sustainable. But we also want to think about what are our consequences when thinking about check-in, check-out systems. And so we need to think about what are our messages to staff and what are our consequences for students receiving minor or major referrals. So we want to really think about what happens if a student shows a behavior outside of the card, right? Outside of the check-in, check-out system. What if they don't meet their goals on the daily progress report? And so we want to make sure that our team is really clear on what these behaviors are and what the expectations are. The team needs to norm on what teachers should do, because one teacher might see a behavior and give 0 points on the card. Another teacher might see that same behavior and send the student to the office or create an office referral. So clarifying with your team will help you be really consistent and make it seem really fair to students. The other thing we don't want is to see a response cost, which means taking those points away. We never want to take away the points that we give students because we know that, one, it's not effective. Research has shown that it is not effective to take away points that you give students. And we also know that it can hurt their self-esteem and lead to more problematic behaviors later in the day. So if at 9 a.m. I've lost all the points that I've earned, that means that for the rest of the day, what is my incentive to be successful, right? To make the right choice. And so we want to make sure that any points that we give students, they can keep. We also want to think about the natural consequences that students might experience if they don't have the opportunity. Maybe they lose the opportunity to earn their reward. Maybe we can use data from the students and feedback from the students to really understand what would make sense in terms of consequences for them. So the more that we can root this in student choice and voice, the better off we are going to be. So those are some things to consider when you are building your check-in, check-out system, making sure that you have a clear acknowledgement system across the entire school, but that you also can use that same system or a slightly modified version of that system at your tier 2 level for your check-in, check-out systems. So now I'm going to pass it over to Nakanya, who's going to talk a little bit about professional development and family support.
Thank you, Christian. So now what we want to look at is what professional development and what are some types of family support that are necessary to support these tier 2 systems that we have built out for our buildings. So utilizing the TFI, we will look at subscale 2.9, which once again looks at the professional development and family support. So just thinking about what are the roles of the coordinator, the facilitators for those interventions, what will be the process that we use to teach and coach all of our staff through the system that we've developed, and then thinking about delivering those interventions, and then how will we seek support when there are barriers to those systems or barriers to actually implementing those interventions. And then how do we utilize our progress report to provide feedback and then monitor that progress? So how do we begin to build out systems to support each of these areas? So in thinking about training your staff, we want to start to think about where is it that we start in training and ensuring that our staff are aware that they have the skills, that they are equipped to be able to implement these systems. So we want to ensure that there is a training on our tier 2 systems and the check-in, check-out system for staff, right? So it's not safe to assume that all staff are aware, that they understand. So thinking about how will we do a training specific to that? And it's okay to start with just maybe a few staff members and scale up. This doesn't have to be something that you pick up and you run with building wide. Maybe just start small and then give yourself an opportunity to scale up. This training should be specific to your building. So just thinking about that, very specific to what you determine as important for your tier 2 systems. How will they work? How will these things look? And once again, those things being specific to your building. This is the time to once again introduce check-in, check-out, and the daily progress monitoring. How will this be done? Going over all of those important pieces to ensure that you are able to implement. And then thinking about ahead of time and proactively thinking about pre-corrections, because we know as much as we implement systems, they are not always 100% effective. We know that there will still be room for error. We know that things will still happen. Misbehavior will still occur. So also thinking about how is it that we are going to actually pre-correct. So just in thinking about being proactive in planning. So just thinking about some other considerations for your staff learning and professional development for staff, thinking about how do you include a refresher or a booster training. So we've done the training, we've begun implementation, and so now we realize that there may be some areas that need to be tweaked, that we may need to further flesh out. But how is it that we will plan for those trainings? So being proactive in setting up any type of refresher or booster sessions that may be necessary for your staff. Also, we understand, and I remember being school-based, staff changes happen as much as we don't want them to. Staff changes happen. There is staff turnover, roles change, you may have substitutes. So thinking about a system to ensure that everyone in your building is properly trained, even those folks who may change roles, your substitute teachers, staff members may leave. So just thinking about those things and taking those into consideration. Also having a system that incorporates staff feedback. Highly encourage, once again, we want to receive just as well as student agency is important. We also want to ensure that we are including staff feedback as well. So how is it that you all are going to determine when, how, where staff will be able to provide feedback around these systems? And also just keeping in mind what support will look like for any other special considerations around staff development. So just making sure, and we know things happen in buildings. I remember working in buildings and it just felt like sometimes things would come out of left field, but just trying to take into consideration those things that happen with staff turnovers, those pieces, and just thinking about who needs to be trained. We may need to implement some different types of trainings for different folks coming in and out, but those things are all important just to ensure that everyone is on the same page and providing the same messaging. So when thinking about student participation, what is it that we want to ensure that our students have? What are those tools that we want to provide to our students to ensure that implementation is actually happening as well? So student voice is just as important when we're thinking about the development of check-in and check-out. So giving them an opportunity to provide voice. How will students be trained? So thinking about how will they understand how this system works, thinking about their daily progress report, just ensuring that they're aware, they have the tools, and that they understand what it is that's happening around them. What are the teachers doing? I hear teachers talking about check-in, check-out, and sometimes it feels like as adults, we sometimes talk around or talk over a child's head, but they also need to be a part of this process. So thinking about that. As we did with our tier 1, it's also critical to include like role plays, discussion of the routines, and then also thinking about what are those responses to being redirected. So we know there are students that still may have misbehavior. There's going to need to be redirection, but being proactive and preparing students so that there are possible role plays and giving them some responses when they may not agree. Say they receive a score that they are unhappy with or that makes them angry or upset. So preparing them for that, and then having role plays, talking with them and giving them those tools so that they are able to respond in a way that we want to see. So once again, setting them up for success using some preventative measures. So how is it that we are going to orientate our families and students to all of these new systems that we have now? This will be new. Parents will hear, and I remember, talking about check-in and check-out, calling a parent to talk about a daily progress report, and they didn't even know what it was. So we don't want those things to happen. So how is it that we are going to ensure for our students and our families that they are aware of this process that now will be happening in our buildings? So just reviewing the who, the what, the when, the where of this entire process. This helps with establishing your routine. So thinking about that, once again, even the pre-correction practice. So just thinking about how is it that you are expected to respond when you may not agree with your score that you received on your daily progress report. So once again, setting them up with those expectations and not assuming that they would know how to respond. And once again, when thinking about teaching those soft skills, those SEL skills, it's okay to be upset, but this is the expectation when you respond when you are upset. And for our families, we want to go through the check-in, check-out process and inform them of, specifically what this is, what are best practices. When do you want to do this? You want to do this as soon as you decide to implement. So if we're thinking about beginning of the school year, when students are coming in to register, when you're handing them a handbook, this could be a part of that handbook. So just making sure that your families are aware that this is a process that happens in the building. And we also want you to be a part of this. At your parent-teacher conference, talking about it, thinking about back to school night, having a newsletter that introduces it, and then just sending reminders in your regular communication, just so that, once again, parents, families, nothing will come as a surprise to them. And they also can be a support partner for you. So things tend to run a little smoother when you call a family, they're aware, versus, well, what's this check-in, check-out system I keep, my child keeps telling me about it. I haven't heard anything about it. So giving them all of the information that they need so that they are able to support you, and then you supporting them and supporting their student with this process. So in your workbook that is in the Google Doc, these are some things just for consideration so that you are able to support the use of the check-in, check-out system, and then training your staff, and then thinking about how is it that you are going to ensure that students are able to have voice and be supported with the system, and then as well your families as well. So just thinking about those things, and there are sample resources within that workbook that's in that Google folder for you to be able to utilize in your building as you begin to plan. So one thing I think is important to remember when we think about all of these different pieces, and I know it's a lot of information, but you don't have to start with your entire building or a huge group. You can start small and then scale up to see how this works for your building. What are some areas that may need to be tweaked or changed, and thinking about what success looks like specifically for your school building, your population, your staff, your students, but starting small with this and then giving you the opportunity to scale up so that you have buy-in from your staff, from your students, and from your families. All right, so now I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Jessica, and she will walk you through data monitoring.
All right, great. Thanks, Nakanya. So this last section is going to be talking about data monitoring. So we use data to look at fidelity and impact of what we're doing. And so in this section, we'll be talking about how do we do that for check-in, check-outs. So going back to the TFI subscale features, these are some of the things under evaluation. We want to, again, make sure that we're using the check-in, check-out system for at least 5% of students, and that we are setting up the criteria, just as Christian had discussed earlier, about how do we know if students are responding to the intervention or not. And again, it's important to use the data to look at, are we making an impact on student performance? And then also, are we doing check-in, check-out as it was intended to be? And then at the end of the year, we kind of look at it holistically and figure out, do we need to revamp check-in, check-out, or is it successful and effective as we are currently implementing it? All right, so this tool is what we call a tier 2 and 3 tracking tool, and it actually can be used not only for check-in, check-out. As you can see, it has other tier 2 interventions there. But we, again, this is kind of our cheat sheet that if you have a coordinator for tier 2, they will be collecting and putting together data from different students. And as you can see for the check-in, check-out column, if you look at the 2 columns, on the first one, you'll see that we enter the number of students participating, and we also put the percentage of students who are responding. So in that first column, we want to put tally up the points and then figure out the percentage. This again is in comparison of the whole student population. And then if you pay attention to look at the gray row at the very bottom, we want to, at the end of the year, look and see what is the average for the whole year. And we want to make sure that at least 70% of students are responding. Otherwise, we know that there is something wrong and there's some way we need to adjust how we're implementing check-in, check-out. This data, as you can see, should be entered at least monthly. Okay, and again, that last row, we want to make sure that we're looking and filling that out as well. Sorry, go ahead, next slide. All right, so that form we will put in the Google folder as well for you to access, and we'll be referring to it in a little bit. So one way to use this tool is to look at student performance data. Again, student data is monitored at least monthly, usually every 2 weeks, but at least we're looking at the end of the month is the percentage of students and using or being considered in tier 2. Is it working for them? And then we have to establish data decision rules to make sure whether we want to fade, intensify, or continue the way we're doing it. And then we want to aggregate the data among all of the stakeholders. So data monitoring at the student level, in order to figure out what the data decision rules are, usually we want to aim for 80% student success. If we know that they have reached that over 4 to 6 weeks, we can figure out how we're going to fade them and exit them. Again, check in, check out is not supposed to be lifetime. We want to make sure that they're getting the support they needed, and hopefully that will be successful and we can fade them out. Again, progress monitoring is important because it answers the following questions. Is the student making progress towards the goal? Is the intervention effective for most of the students receiving the intervention? And is the intervention being implemented with fidelity? All right, so here's some examples of database decision rules, some samples that you may want to consider. Of course, we want to make sure that you adjust it for however you feel fits your school context. So identification for check-in, check-out to get them into the intervention. You may have a decision rule where you're looking at 2 or more office discipline referrals, okay, or 4 or more classroom managed incidents, attendance, work completion, referral from family, student or school staff. Again, if in part 1 of this, we talked about that lime green. If you're looking at the triangle, we want the mild or minor incidents. We don't want to get it too complicated. But we want to make sure that students are getting support and extra tier 1 attention and feedback for students who are just starting to slip a little. As they are on the intervention, we want to make sure that we're progress monitoring, and we don't want to necessarily wait until the end of the 4 to 6 weeks. We want to make adjustments in between as needed, but then we really look at the end of the 4 to 6 week. We need to give it time for the intervention to work. And then exiting, getting them out, we want to say about the student should receive at least 80% of their daily progress report points. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're entering that data so that we can make decisions. Again, our decisions the data will then allow us to decide if we want to fade, continue, or intensify. So let's quickly go over what each of these mean. So fade, again, if the student has met the graduation criteria, then we celebrate, right? We don't want to just not have it go unnoticed. We want to make sure that we acknowledge it, celebrate, and we want to fade it out. We don't necessarily want to just, not pay attention to them anymore. We may just check in less frequently. We may have them start to self-monitor. We may give them other opportunities to use some skills to be a student leader, and then also help other adults check in and check out other students. So giving them, empowering them with some responsibility. We may have them mentor other students. So again, building that student leadership. And we can also celebrate by sharing stories to other key stakeholders. Okay, continuing, if the student has not met the graduation or exit criteria, and further check in, check out could result in success, and we know that this is still a good intervention for them, we either keep them in check in, check out, but we also don't want to have them stay there being stagnant without fading or intensifying. Okay, so we need to make sure that, you know, if they need a little more time to be in it, that's great, but then we have to make a decision whether we're going to fade or intensify. So what does intensify mean? So if the student has not met the graduation or exit criteria, and further check in, check out, we know that fidelity is there and it's still not resulting in success, then we either give adding additional check in, check out time throughout the day, means intensifying the times we're meeting with them may be needed. We can let them bring a friend to check in, check out. You know, maybe that helps them get some extra support from their peers. We can also have them choose an adult that they prefer to have a check in, check out with. So someone that they have a strong relationship, that might be a little bit more effective in making sure that maybe that they need that feedback from someone they trust. And then maybe extending the time you meet with them, maybe just a few more minutes, but be careful that we don't want to make too much time into this intervention, because then it becomes another one, right? Like a mentoring model. So again, we want to stick to the fidelity of a quick check in, check out, maybe extending for a few more minutes if needed. All right, so there is a worksheet that is in the workbook that you can practice. It's just some different data points where you can look at different students and, you know, have your colleagues think about who would get an intervention. And then the directions of the activity will be in that worksheet as well. Okay, so fidelity data is just as important. And so we want to make sure that there is a routine and schedule established to collect the fidelity data. So oftentimes we skip this step, right? So we want to make sure that all the adults who are assigned with a caseload of students, that we're making sure that they are meeting them as scheduled. So, you know, we want to make sure that that's in place. And again, we're monitoring for fidelity that 70% of the students who are enrolled in check in, check out should be responding. Again, use that tracking tool to help monitor whether the implementation is working or not. And I'm sorry, that last bullet point got cut off, but again, we use the data to also celebrate success. We mentioned earlier that we have the TFI that is a fidelity tool that gives you a checklist of tier 2 in general, but this check in, check out fidelity tool is specifically for that. So it gives you a little bit more specific measures for this particular intervention, but it has a lot of some similar language in terms of the systems that are aligned to the TFI. And then bringing it together. If you are using the TIPS model, this form, again, there's one for tier 1, but there's also one for a tier 2 check in, check out. And again, those boxes just kind of give you a guide of what data should be looked at and what will be used for data decision making. So as you can see, those are the important things. It looks a little tedious, but it's again everything that we just reviewed. All right. Again, if the tracking tool is there, the important thing again is to evaluate it at the end of the year. That average for the year is on the bottom. So when you tally that up and look at the average, it'll tell you whether that tier 2 check in, check out was successful and effective. And again, it's that annual evaluation. What do we need to do to make it better for the following year? All right. So a tier 2 systems team meeting, again, this meeting or this team is not looking at individual students and problem solving. So it's not your SST meeting, but it's more so looking at the systems. And I know that this is probably new for a lot of folks because we want to dive in and look at why isn't this particular student responding? Instead, we look at the system. And I think that is a mind shift where we're always paying attention to the students, but we also need to really be paying attention to the systems, which are really about the adult behavior. Again, that 70% is the key to looking at 70% of students should be responding if it's working well. If not, then we look at and try to figure out a summary using a precision statement. And we mentioned this in our tier 1 trainings, where we're really looking at our data and our numbers to come up with a kind of a hypothesis as to why they are not responding. So there's an example there of a precision statement. Again, we don't want to make it broad saying, oh, these students are just not responding because this is not working. We try to figure out why using the data. And again, that coordinator updates the team on the plan, whether to continue FADE or intensify for certain students. And again, going back to that annual evaluation, using that last line to again figure out what is the overall effectiveness and efficiency of the interventions. And again, that tracking tool is not only for check and check out, you can use it for your modified check and check out groups if you have one that's centered around academic skills or for a certain social skill. Again, that is a great tool to layer on or look at your other tier 2 interventions across the board. Okay, one more time, there it is. Again, you'll see that it also starts to increase in terms of the level of intensity. So you have from the left check and check out, then you have a modified check and check out where you're really focusing it on a certain skill. So that's when you get your overall school expectations and you may tailor it to a certain social or academic skill. Or you might individualize a check and check out for using groups and mentoring. If that's not working, then you may go to a brief FBA, informal FBA using a behavior intervention plan. And then that folds over into more the tier 3 where it's complex FBAs with a behavior plan as well as wraparound support. So it's that continuum of a tier 2 and tier 3 tracking tool. Okay, once we go through the evaluation of our tier 2 interventions, we also want to still map and figure out what do we have at tier 1 and who's in charge. So this becomes a great review of what we did over the year, but also what do we need to maybe add or adjust for the following year. Again, we're looking at annual evaluation. So here on the left, this is an example of kind of a matrix of your tier 1 interventions, where you see what practices, programs, initiatives are in place, and then who receives support because it's tier 1, it's all students. But we want to also look at who is providing those interventions and practices, and then how is progress monitoring occurring. Similarly, we do a resource map for tier 2. And that is, again, you start off with the mild, minor behaviors using a check and check out systematic system. That's the same for students who are in that. And then it bumps up to a modified if we need to tailor it to certain skills. Same thing as tier 1, we go across and see who is providing the support, how is it being monitored, and how do they exit. All right, so that brings us to just a wrap up of what we learned today. And Christian, that is all you.
All right, well, so we've gone through part 1, we've gone through part 2. We talked about how to layer on tier 2 as part of a broader system in your MTSS supports for students, how to use decision rules to either fade, continue, or intensify, how to establish check in, check out as a tier 2 intervention for your students, different types of daily progress reports you can use, how to collect data and review, how to build your tier 2 team, and how to use Fidelity to measure for success. Woo, that is a lot. All right. So thank you so much for watching part 1 and part 2 with us, joining us on this journey. In order to get credit for your attendance, there is a survey we would like you to fill out. You can find the survey on the bit.ly on your screen or using the QR code. There are a few different things that you'll have to do in that survey. I guess it's less of a survey and more of an exit ticket. So go ahead and take some time to enter that in, and as soon as you do, we will follow up with a certificate for you. So go to that bit.ly there or use that QR code. Again, here is our information. My email is on the screen, so if you'd like to reach out to learn more or get extra support, please do. The information for our website, our upcoming trainings, and our monthly newsletter is on the screen too. So please go there and sign up if you'd like to learn more about our work or our colleagues' work. Again, we are thankful for you taking your time to learn a little bit more about how to establish and implement tier 2 interventions for your students, and we hope to see you sometime soon. Bye, everyone.